Is temptation a sin? The word concupiscence captures the idea of temptation, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the pride of life. And we're going to talk about that today and how Christians debate the idea of whether or not this is a sin. But one thing that we can all agree on is that this is a result of the fall and that this is being disordered from God. So we're going to talk about that today. Welcome back to Lay Theology. Today we're going to talk about concupiscence or temptation. And so in 1 John 2:17, this is the general framework that defines what this word is about. And I'm not going to say the word the whole time, but it's a fun word, so sometimes I'll say it. But in 1 John 2:17, it says, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, and also its lusts, but the one who does the will of God lives forever." So here you have this idea that lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life, that these things are a result of the fall. It talks about them being of the world, and the world is passing away. The world is passing away because of the fall. And so there's disagreement on whether these things are sins or not, and we'll get into that a little bit. But essentially you have the Catholic view, the Roman Catholic view, that these things are not a sin, that in order for them to be sin, you must act on them, or at least have, there's a line that they draw, and they would better be able to explain it than I can from their perspective. But essentially there would be a line that they would draw that when you get into like a deeper desire for those things, not just the temptation itself, that then it becomes sin. Whereas the Lutheran perspective and a lot of the traditional Protestant perspectives are that when you have a disordered desire from God, when you have even the initial desire, it is a sin because it is you being disordered from God. And so those are the two main views. We know that Christ was tempted, and so we'll read this really quick. In Hebrews 5:15, it says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." So this idea of temptation, there's at least, if you're a Protestant, there's got to be at least two different forms of temptation. But actually, you'll find that Catholics and Protestants tend to agree a little bit, at least, on some of these details and things that Christ didn't have as temptation and things that he did. So we know that Christ was tempted 3 times. In fact, if you look at the 3 ways that he was tempted, it was aimed at each one of those 3 things that we talked about in 1 John. You have the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And I'm going to make probably another longer form video about this later, to get into those, because those match up with both Eve's temptation, Christ's temptation, and then they match up with the 1 John passage. And so these are the things, these are the ways that people are generally tempted. And so sometimes a Catholic might argue that Christ was tempted in these things, therefore the temptation itself cannot be a sin. But a lot of Catholics would, when pressed, actually agree with Protestants on some of this. Christ was tempted externally. He was tempted by the devil to do these things, right? The devil was saying, throw yourself down, those kinds of things. The devil was the one who was giving him the temptation, right? It wasn't his internal desire to be disordered from God that was happening. It was the devil trying to tempt him with the same things that we are tempted with, right? And so Christ could not have, or at least my argument is that Christ could not have those same internal desires as us, despite being tempted in the same way that we are. He was tempted with the same 3 primary, well, they are the main ways, the only ways of being tempted, I would argue. They're the only ways of being tempted. All temptation is the result of lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And so Christ, when being tempted, he's being tempted externally. And even Catholics would agree that he probably didn't have that internal desire towards those things, because then he would be disordering himself from himself, because Christ cannot be disordered from God because he is God. Those thoughts, as passages point out, as the 1 John passage even talks about, are of this world. They're from this world, right? They're from the fall. Despite Christ taking on human form and taking on human nature, he was not given over to sin like we are. As I talk about in another video, he didn't need freedom from slavery to sin because he didn't have that. And so most Catholics, when pressed on this, will actually agree, hey, you're right. He didn't have that internal disordered lust for these things that humans do, right? And so my big argument on that is that Christ didn't have those things because those would disorder him from God. My other argument is that being disordered from God is in itself sinful. And so I'm not going to make this a super long video, right? So we'll talk about a couple of other things. In 2 Corinthians 10:5, it says, "We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And we are ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete." So it's talking about taking our thoughts captive to the obedience of Christ. So our thoughts can even become captive to Christ when we are made to be believers, right? And so if our thoughts can be reconciled to Christ, then we don't have to. I know that we will continue to sin until the day we die. We will still continue to have sin. We will never completely stop sinning until we are in the kingdom and fully renewed. But if our thoughts can be made captive to Christ, then we actually have this idea that, that disorder from God is not something that we innately have to have with our new nature. Our new nature allows us to not be disordered from God in this way. And if we are supposed to be taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, then we are actually obligated to try and work on not being disordered in this way. And so I would argue that someone who is not doing what they're supposed to do and continues to be disordered, at the very least, that becomes sin, right? And I think Catholics would agree with me on that. I would say that disorder itself is a sin, and that in our new creation, that when we're made a new creation, that we are able to, with this new nature, bring some of that order back. Not on our own. God works in us to bring us back to that order. But my argument is that we're called to be captive to Christ, not captive to sin. And so even if you would argue that those lusts are not sin themselves, the thoughts are also, according to this, to be captive to Christ. So we're still responsible, at the very least, for limiting these things. And again, that's through the work of God. So I'm not saying just us alone. God renews us. But here we go. We're going to go through Philippians 4:8. It says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things." Right? This is a very common verse. Most people are at least somewhat familiar with this verse. But it's all of these good things. These are what we're supposed to dwell on. And so my argument is that at the very, and I know most people would agree with me, even if they disagree on the temptations being sin. My argument is that we are called to become more like Christ. Christ would not have had those internal temptations because he couldn't be disordered from himself because he is God, right? And so we are called to also be reconciled in this way. And this talks about it in another commandment. So again, you can sin by both not doing what you're told to, as well as doing things that are innately wrong, right? So it becomes innately wrong to not do what you're called to do. Your thoughts should be able to become captive, right? And so also in this way, it's telling you that you're supposed to dwell on these other things. And some would say, well, it doesn't say that you can't have any outside thoughts, right? It says that you're supposed to dwell on them. But the purpose of this is that you are supposed to dwell on these things to fix the way that you think, and to think only on what is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute. If there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. And at this last part, I'm going to wrap this up with one final thought. Again, my argument is that you are called, even if you don't believe in concupiscence being a sin, you are called, at the very least, as I've shown in multiple passages here, and there's plenty more. I'm not going to do a long video on this right now, but you are called to order your thoughts to Christ. And I'm going to finish on these verses are some of my favorite from my whole life, basically. And I know that these are commonly people's favorites. So I'm not super unique in finding these verses interesting. These are pretty common verses for people to have as like their life verses or whatever. But in Romans 12, 1 and 2, and if I botch some of this, I apologize. I have this memorized in a different version. But it says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." Some others say this is your spiritual act of worship, right? And then it says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." This is talking about your transformation being the renewing of your mind. Your mind is supposed to be renewed to the state that it was supposed to be before sin. And so, people would argue that when Eve was tempted, that she didn't sin until she ate. And there might be, some value in looking at that. But the point being that the internal desire to do those things is disordered from God. So even still, Eve is disordering herself from God by allowing those things to tempt her. And that's what the Protestant view is saying becomes sin. You allowing those things to be common. You allowing those things, these results of the fall, because these are the results of the fall, to be disordered in this way. You allowing these things to actually tempt you is at the very least disordered from God. And this talks about you being renewed, having your mind renewed, being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And it says so that you may prove what the will of God is. So this renewal also helps you prove what the will of God is. And the will of God is not for you to remain in a state that's disordered from him. It says, "Prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." Or pleasing, perfect will of God is some of the other versions. But essentially you have this idea. You're called to be a living sacrifice, which is really wild to phrase it that way. You're supposed to live as a sacrifice. And, sacrifices are not alive, but in this case, we're supposed to live where our will is more Christ's will and God's will than our own. And so we are supposed to live as a living sacrifice, right? Acceptable to God. And it says this is your spiritual service of worship. Some versions even say this is your reasonable act of worship. It's reasonable for you to live as a living sacrifice. And then not to be conformed to the world. Remember, we just read that for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. Do not be conformed to this world. That's what Romans 12:2 says. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You're renewing your mind. You're not supposed to live in this way anymore. That's of the world, right? I think even regardless of whether you think that the temptation itself, the internalized temptation, the desire to sin, whether you think that's sin or not, it is certainly of the world and not something we're called to. And instead, this is saying not to be conformed to the world and be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So I'm trying to keep this as edifying as possible to anyone despite their views on this. It says so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. We renew our minds. We have our minds renewed so that we can test the will of God in a way that is holy, because there's bad ways to test God. But we're trying to find what his will is and what is good and acceptable to him, perfect. And so we are called to be transformed, to live as sacrifices, and to have our minds renewed, be more like him, less like the world. And those things are of the world. The lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life, they're of the world, right? That's what 1 John talks about. So we're not called to those things. We're called to be renewed. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for watching. This is Lay Theology.